Hello and welcome everybody. It's RowingChat again, and I'm Rebecca Carrow, your host from Rowperfect. Now, of course, I've got a guest with me today. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Drew Ginn, and I'm currently the national head coach for the Australian rowing team. And I wouldn't say formally, but I've been an athlete who's competed at 4 Olympic Games and fortunate enough to achieve 3 gold medals in that time.
You're a pretty medalled man in a tough discipline. So you've been around the world a few times with rowing. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in the sport.
Look, I'll make it really short and simple. For this one, I was a maths teacher, Bram McLeod, who took the interest in me as a student at school and grabbed me, took me out of the boat sheds one day, put me in a boat, and it all began from there.
You just love at first sight, or were you one of those kids who did every sport?
No, look, I did every sport, and the thing for me was, I think what Bram identified was I'd been involved in other sports activities and had done reasonably well, and so the key one for me was, what he sort of saw in a student, and it wasn't love at first sight because I went swimming in the Yarra River, and so that wasn't particularly pleasant on the first occasion. And the interesting thing about your first rowing experience is they often don't teach you how to get back in the boat straight away. And so I was given all these nice instructions about how to row, but not so much about how to climb back in the boat. So that was the first experience, but very quickly afterwards I came to realise how enjoyable the sport could be.
Fantastic. So as a coach now, it's kind of poacher turned gamekeeper, isn't it? Do you have to teach your athletes how to get back in the boat?
Well, fortunate enough for me, I'm going to be probably one of the few head coaches of national teams that isn't actually coaching a crew. So I'm more working with the coaches, but it's interesting to think about helping athletes understand how to get out of situations when they make errors and not so much falling out of the boat, but certainly working out how to be a bit more adaptable is certainly a philosophy that I've got.
Fabulous. Let's kick off into some of the questions that we've had in from viewers. A lovely one that's come in from Thomas Carter in the UK asking, since becoming a coach, have you had any revelations about rowing that you didn't realise during your time when you were a rower?
Yes, sitting in the coaching boat is extremely cold. That's the first one. That's the first thing I notice big time in terms of sitting out there. Probably not revelations, but probably some simple reminders and realisations that hark back to sort of probably the very basics that you learn as an athlete. So nothing sort of new yet, but certainly really good reminders so far. The thing that I'm probably noticing a lot more about is that coach-athlete relationship. When you're sitting in the rowing boat, you're very aware of the feeling of the boat. You're very aware of your crewmate. You're aware of the water. You're aware of all those bits and pieces that are the information that you're sort of getting in terms of the feel. You're very aware of the demand of someone outside of you, the expectation they have. But that true connection and engagement is quite different watching it from the speedboat as to, I suppose, the challenge that coaches have, trying to help their athletes move in different ways, adapt in different ways, and even being coachable, taking things on and being able to show that they can shift what they're doing, move, change, whatever it might be. From in the boat, it always seemed like it was easier to do, but on the outside, you notice for the coaches, it's often very, very difficult. They've got an idea in their mind that they want the athletes to do, and so then watching that dynamic and then watching it over a number of days or weeks is really fascinating. So there's a realisation of how difficult that can be for a coach when they can see something for an athlete that an athlete can't necessarily see for themselves.
That's really interesting because, of course, you've actually come into coaching at close on the highest level in the world without having, as it were, done your porridge at state level or club level. Is there a particular challenge there for you?
Credibility has probably been the biggest thing, Rebecca, and probably not credibility from a performer or an athlete, but certainly with some of our senior coaches, credibility around, well, you haven't coached at this level, how can you help us? And so breaking down, I suppose, those barriers or developing the trust in our coaching group has been the biggest thing. And so I've probably spent 12 months just developing relationships with people and helping people understand that they don't need to see me as a threat necessarily, but also helping people understand that they probably don't need to just see me as the athlete either. And so Chris O'Brien, I think, spent 12 years with me and probably understood that as an athlete, I was operating a little bit differently in the boat. And I did a bit of coaching throughout my years as an athlete anyway, but also I'd moved into doing a lot of corporate work with people in terms of presenting and facilitating and in the education space as well as the corporate space. So I think letting others for the 12 months get to know me and get to see what I can bring to the table, but also me getting to know them, and it is just building that trust amongst myself and the coaching group.
Very, very interesting. And how can you tell how you're going? Are you breaking through? Because am I right, this is a completely new role?
It is a completely new role. Well, and in fact, it started out as there were two roles advertised. One as head coach integration, being the role that I got, and that was really about helping bring our national team together from a technical perspective, but also from an energetic but also strategic perspective as to unifying our team, given that geographically we're so spread. The other role was designed to be high performance head coach of performance. But what's happened in the 12 months is it's been sort of seen generally that we don't necessarily need another head coach. And so my role now has sort of gradually moved into being the only head coach for the country. But what we've identified is a new structure where we've got category lead.
Drew, can you hear us again?
Yeah, I can.
Sorry, go back to the structure of the category lead. If you can then repeat, we just lost a bit of sound.
Yeah, so the structure that we've put in place over the last 12 months, and we're still evolving it, is category leads. And so we've got the 7 category leads, being men's sweep, women's sweep, men's sculling, women's sculling. We've got a lightweight category lead coach for the men, and a lightweight category lead coach for the women, as well as a para lead, and he's managing the para program. So my role is really working with those leads to help deliver the strategy.
That's fantastic. And I'd just like to ask a couple of questions about the structure of Australian sport and where you particularly think rowing is heading, because as I understand it, you are now decentralised at state level as a decentralised training model, which is obviously in contrast with New Zealand or Great Britain, where they're primarily centralised.
Yeah, you're right. And one of the things that I think got identified in our sport over the last 4-year cycles was probably 8 years ago to 4 years ago, we tried to centralise. And I'm not sure if it was enough of a push or didn't seem to be working, or just a bit of the Australian way, a little bit. We are such a big country, and states are quite removed from each other. The club system's diverse, the school system. So we've realised that let's not fight the geographic situation. We can't necessarily be like what they're doing in GB or even in Canada to a degree, or Great Britain, but rather let's embrace our geographic situation. What we are trying to do is centralise the high performance area from the strategic element, and obviously bring our leads together more regularly. We still have a national rowing centre here at the RAS, which is the Australian Rowing Team's centre. But ultimately what we're trying to do is centralise communication, centralise, I suppose, data, centralise in other ways, but not centralise physically in terms of bringing everyone into the same spot. Which means that we engage, I think, hopefully we can engage better with our schools and clubs and ensure that the pathways out there are made clearer and a bit easier. And so then we tap into the wider population. I think we're not blessed with just having ridiculously high numbers of athletes trying to row after school. So by getting every state centre operating a bit better and knowing that there's a clear vision for the national team, I think can pay dividends down the track. But we're very much in the phase of that being developed. The idea is there, and I think it was born out of the challenges we had with trying to bring everyone to, say, one location like Canberra.
Mm-hmm. And from the athlete's point of view, do they need to be full-time, or can they compete while they're still doing high work or study loads?
Yeah. Oh, look, and that's a really good question. I suppose, can they compete full-time? Ultimately, to win the Olympic Games, I think we need to have athletes full-time. To win medals, to make finals, you need to have a high level of commitment from an athlete over an extended period of time. What we do know is that if it takes, 2 Olympic game cycles or 3 Olympic game cycles for a lot of our athletes to get the best results out of them, then that first games experience might more be about exposure and learning, and then doing that in such a way that they're finishing their studies, starting a bit of part-time work. I do think that when we really want to push athletes for, or them striving to get that medal or that gold medal, and if that is their second or third games, is that we need them to really be consistent over a 2 to 3 year period. So I think we've learnt from the legacy of the awesome foursome, which was they take time off. There's a benefit to that, but the disadvantage is that the rest of the world keeps forging forward. So, we're trying to manage, I suppose, the needs of our athletes to become educated and become set up for careers and work, but also making sure that it's a long distance to travel overseas, and we want to make sure that at the end of the 10 or 12 years of their career, they've got something to go into, but also that they've competed on a level playing field with others by doing the same amount of training.
Fantastic. Let's move on to some questions that are coming through about technique. You're known for having strong opinions on rowing technique, and this has come from John in Oxford. Should the finish be through the heel or the ball of the foot?
Oh, it's a good question. Look, for me, I'll put it into context. Years ago, we did a lot of push off the toes and press from the toes. Towards the back end of my career, we started focusing more on holding the heels down as we pressed and really trying to support the boat speed through the back as we released that way. So it's been a bit toe orientated and it's become a bit more heel orientated at the back end of the career.
Very interesting. Give us some examples as to how you might teach that.
Yeah, look, I think probably I'll go back a step to say that I think both are required. So having an athlete appreciate the feeling that they can get by pushing off the toes is worthwhile, and having an athlete get the feeling of what it's like to really hold the heels down and really push the full foot is required. From a drills perspective, the thing for me is I love feet out. I like the idea of the feet being unstrapped and really learning how to accelerate or hold the pressure against the blade face as long as possible in the drive without overworking it. And I think when your feet are out and you're really holding the pressure against the blade face, it forces you into feeling that you've got to keep the heel down and maintain contact with the foot stretcher that way. Doing that with square blades, I mean, these are all the really basic drills, but doing that with square blades, doing that at higher stroke rates is a really interesting exercise to teach athletes to really push and press and hold the load. And then when you release, you get that really nice sensation of then feeling for the body rhythm off the back. I think we see it in our athletes is all too often if they lose contact with the foot plate and then their body starts to drop and the handle doesn't keep it holding the pressure against the blade, then they're trying to manufacture some sort of rhythm or speed of boat speed off the turn. That for me looks a bit forced, and so what I like to look at is that ability to press, hold the load, generate the right and appropriate speed, and then move and let the boat move under the athlete rather than the athlete moving to the boat, if that makes sense.
So from that description, what are the mechanics and the feel then of the back end of the stroke as you row it? Yeah,
look, Nick Green years ago in the Four, when I got involved in late 95, 96, made mention about this sensation of carving the blade out, and so I always liked that feeling. For me, the feeling that I've always aimed for, and it is a bit dependent contextually on who you're in the boat with, what the matchup is, what the stability is, but I love the sensation of getting a lot of load on the blade face early in the stroke and then learning how to hang as long as possible and hold that pressure against the blade face and really hold that water. So the release and the last part of the draw is really about holding the load in the hands all the way to the point of release, but then letting the release be super relaxed. I think, in all the years that I rode with James Tompkins in the Four and with Duncan Free and all that sort of stuff, I was in the bow seat, and so I was always looking for making the timing of the release as easy and as comfortable and as well timed as possible, so it was efficient. And I always found that if I overworked the back half too much, it was hard to time. But if I kept the pressure just enough in the hands that had been generated from the foot stretcher off the front, you just hold, and that last little bit of the arm draw isn't about adding any more. It's just about maintaining that pressure so that when you get to that point of just before the stomach, you can actually time the release really easily, and then your pair partner in front of you or the guys around you in the boat, you get that really that lovely sense of, I suppose, timing and ease of movement, and there doesn't seem to be a rush or a forcedness off the back turn. So for me, it was always about not overworking the arm draw, but just holding the pressure as much as possible.
Moving on now to a question from Lena, who's also in the UK. She asks, in the drive, should the back and knees open together rather than the knees down and then the back opening? So she's talking about sequential body movements as opposed to simultaneous.
Look, I think over the years, I've probably been a person that personally blended that quite a bit, and it's a bit different when you're sitting behind people and trying to match up in timing. I do like the intent of legs first, body swing, arm draw, and it's much easier to do when you're at 18 strokes a minute, much harder to do when you're at 37, 38 strokes a minute. I'm comfortable with watching the bodies open with the legs a little bit off the front, as long as it's producing boat speed. If it's not producing boat speed, then there's no point doing it. But I think when I personally sat in the boat, the intent was always almost hips first, and then trust that the body will come with it at the appropriate time as the boat starts to release. So it's not full sequential, but I suppose the intent is to be sequenced in that regard. Certainly when the boat's at its slowest speed, about a foot into the stroke, into the drive phase, it's nice to know that you're engaged with the hips and you're very much hanging off the handle. And so if the body's been activated a little bit to do that, that's okay, as long as it's not the body coming too fast too soon. Because otherwise you do tend to see the boat stall in the drive phase rather than that really sharp pickup off the front where the boat sort of looks like it's being quite elastic, if that makes sense.
So you mentioned about the boat stalling in the drive phase. Thinking from the coach's point of view, and I'm hoping that Lena is a coach as well as an athlete, what should the coach be able to see if that's happening?
The visual for me, Rebecca, is if you watch the handle and the seat relationship, I think it's a nice one to sort of say if the handle and seat moves together, that's a pretty good indicator that the coordination and timing is being picked up. The relationship for me is if you're going to go any other way, is to leave, have the seat almost initiate the drive phase without the handle coming too quickly. The disaster for me is when you see the handle start to come before the seat comes. And so handle coming over seat, what I often see from the side is the weight seems to bear down back through the pelvis and through the foot stretcher, and it's almost like you can sort of see the boat not really lift once the catch has been taken. So if you're watching the stern, instead of seeing the stern as they're rolling into the front, instead of seeing the stern gradually drop and then have a little quick check and then back up in terms of how it sits in the water, you see the stern check down as they take the catch, and it takes half the stroke before it comes back up. And I think that's stalling the boat for me, is the delayed return of the stern back up into that level position. And if you time it right and you coordinate the handle and seat together, you'll often see the stern drop very quickly and then straight back up on that level plane.
So what are the key points of the recovery now in order to make a good catch and initiation of the drive?
Oh, now we're getting interesting, aren't we? My greatest frustration is how we row the catch. And I think a lot of what happens in terms of the recovery is determined or dictates what the catch is. You hear from people all the time that use heavyweights as a reference. The heavyweights don't have quite the skill at the front as the lightweights do, so therefore they've got to get themselves well and truly set and make things uncomplicated for the front turn. I think how you row the recovery on the rhythm, and the Kiwi pair for me is an exceptional example of doing this, particularly at speed, where from the release to the front turn, the handle is just continuous. And in fact, if you watch it, it almost looks like it gradually increases speed, but it's not the handle increasing speed, it's the boat increasing speed under them. So the reference for me is that if you force the movement at any stage in the recovery and you're ahead of the rhythm of the boat, then you've got to slow that down, or you've got to stop at some sort of stage, and the front turn then becomes a bit stiff and rigid and stop-start in many respects. So I think if an athlete can feel the flow from the release point to the front turn, and then trust that the front turn is actually an extension of the recovery. It's not you roll out, stop, and then try to put it back in the water as you're going back. You actually have to make it the extension. And so the best catches that I've seen are people who are extremely relaxed, who have a great sense of getting the body over but not rushing that, and they know how to extend the arm draw away from the hip almost all the way forward. And so from outside, it looks like a very sweeping sort of movement. And you can see this even in scullers, I think. And they have a lot of confidence to know where the catch is. And I think the athletes are either coached to get themselves almost too set, too rigid, seem to be trying to work out where the catch is on the way forward rather than trusting they know where the catch is, if that makes sense.
That's great. You mentioned the Kiwi pair. Obviously, you've
Yes.
been in a pretty fast pair or two during your career. Which was your fastest ever pairs race?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, pure time-wise, obviously, the 2002 race was the quickest speed that we're in a race with Matt Pinson and James Cracknell when they did the 14. Obviously, nothing like doing a 6:08. I think for me, the 99 pair was pretty amazing as to how far we were able to get in front of the field there, and really didn't do anything in the last 500 metres. Of any great note, either technically or physically, and still managed to go, I think, 18 or 19 or whatever it was. So my guide is always been that the 99 race was one of those sublime sort of races you're in, and 2007 was much the same sort of feeling with Duncan Free. And so I think when you can get that far out in front of a pair field, 7 seconds with 500 metres to go, and that's what those two races I think were from memory, around that sort of mark. It means that you're travelling exceptionally quick, and you've usually pretty much got it right in the groove where your effort, your relaxation, all is in unison. And when you watch the Kiwi pair, for me, I think they're managing to do that for not only 1,500 metres but 2,000 metres, and I think when you watch them, it's not like they're going any quicker than anyone in the first five. Historically, in fact, they often don't go quite as fast as some others have gone in the first five, but their ability to sit on 132s, 131s all the way down the track is exceptional. And I think what they're doing is they're rowing the rhythm of the boat really well at that speed, and they're getting a lot more out of their boat, out of the water, than all their competitors. And so for me, looking back on my time, was when I rowed with James and even that time with Duncan in Munich, it felt like we were getting a lot of value out of the 50% of the time which is out of the water, and we got a lot of value out of that out of water time. We probably weren't producing much more power, any more power than anyone else. Maybe rowing a little bit longer in the drive phase, but certainly the out of water stuff is where you get the biggest gains. And I think the New Zealand pair are doing that exceptionally well. They're a class above everyone almost in the world of rowing with that ability at the moment.
Given that they did that 6:08 at Eton in not overly fast conditions, do you think you could have beaten them?
No, in all honesty, probably not. Look at it objectively as a competitor, hell yeah, would have had a crack at it. As a person sitting on the sidelines watching and enjoying what they're doing in the sport, no, rationally no. But as a competitor, if I was sitting in a boat right now, I'd back myself in to have a crack at it. And I like the idea that they're pretty bold and pretty cheeky in that regard. I think what I enjoy about them is I think they've taken some good leads and lessons of the past, and they've watched how the pairs have been rowed. They've seen the history of it all, and they've built on the history. And I think it's probably very similar in the vein of what I was trying to do with Duncan and James and I tried to do on the back of guys like Pinson and Redgrave and Cracknell and all that sort of stuff. I think we've tried to build on the past performers and learn from what they were doing and take the event forward. The pair is one of those events that in 20 years, it's one of the biggest improvements since the early 90s. And it's not surprising when you look at the athletes, but also I think a lot of the athletes have been very respectful for how others have done it before them, and the curiosity has been, how do you take it further? So rationally, no, we never went that fast, but we always thought we could go into 6:10, but just probably not what they're able to do. That's to go a half a boat length or a boat length quicker than what we were anticipating we could go. That's really enjoyable to watch.
Fantastic. Moving on to a slightly different aspect of your career, which was injury. Did you have to modify your posture or your technique to cope with a back injury, and what did you do?
Yeah, so Rebecca, I think it was just a week ago, someone asked me a similar question, one of the coaches, and I described a story about 1998, rowing with Mike Mackay in the pair, and I got myself injured the first time, lower back, just ever so slight in terms of strain, and I deliberately modified my movement. How I modified it was I rolled my hips back and flexed a bit more from the thoracic, and I seemed to take load out of the lower back, and we actually won Lucerne 2 weeks later after having a back injury. So I have modified in the past. What I found was coming back after Sydney with the surgery and missing the home games was it took me 2 years to get back to moving the way I wanted to row. So I think you can modify, is what I'm sort of saying here. I don't necessarily know it's ideal if you want to make the boat go as fast as possible. And so 2002, I certainly felt like I was rowing less load through the front turn and far more almost middle and finish sort of pressure behind James, and it wasn't as effective, it wasn't as fast off the start. And so then in the 2003 period, I worked quite consciously on the water but off the water to be able to get myself forward and get myself in a strong position again where I could actually push the legs almost maximally off the front. But that took 18 months to 2 years to be able to get my stability back, develop my posture, really work with the people on the land-based training to be able to do that. So ideally for me, the injury, what it did was it changed my movement consciously but also unconsciously, and I think it made it harder to get boat speed initially. But eventually we got back to, I think, with Duncan Free, I felt like I was rowing the same way as I always wanted to row and always was being coached to row by Noel Donaldson and coaches like that back in the early days, which was leg drive first and then really swing off at the second half.
So from that, can I infer that what you were taught in your early days at international level was something that you actually cycled around and then came back to, or was it a pattern that actually you never deviated from?
No, definitely deviated from, and probably didn't cycle around to being exactly the same as the 96 period. But I always thought that what Noel and the original four were doing from a sequencing perspective and an emphasis perspective of legs, body, arms, body, legs was fundamentally very, very sound. And so, but when you get a back injury, pushing the legs or driving the legs off the front turn is actually quite challenging. And your body, mentally you don't feel like you can do it, but your body also is very protective. And so for those listening, obviously, when you do that exercise of 30% pressure, 70% pressure, once I got a back injury, I felt like I was rowing like that all the time.
Interesting.
And it took me a long time to get back to getting the load on the blade face at the catch. And one of the things I think the foursome did with Noel was they were very effective. They probably disguised it a lot, but they were very effective with getting blade on the load on the blade face in the first foot of the stroke, and then being able to hold that pressure against the blade face right the way through. But when you've got a back injury, that feels really vulnerable. It feels scary to do, because you feel like you're going to break down every time.
So it took you a few years, obviously, to recover and get back your form.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And from a style perspective, I think I tried to row similarly because I looked up to the movement of the Awesome Foursome. I tried to row similarly to what I'd been taught then. But obviously my style, my movement pattern, I think refined and changed gradually over time, but the intent was probably still the same.
Our next question is from Erin Cafaro from the US, and she asked, what did you learn or do differently after every injury?
Yeah, lots of injuries, lots of good lessons. Actually, I'll start by saying that I think injury is actually really helpful as long as it doesn't divert your opportunity in your career significantly. So, had lots of injuries. Obviously, the back injuries, injuries thoracic, knee problems at times, some ankle issues at times. Most of these injuries weren't caused in the boat. Most of them were caused in the gym or playing frisbee or touch rugby or various things like that. So the thing I'd suggest there is most of our rowers tend to get, I still see, and I got it for myself, tend to get injuries in other ways. What did I learn? The back injury taught me that I had to be a lot smarter and more empathetic to my body. And particularly the first time, I thought, like a lot of our athletes and myself, I thought I was invincible. I thought pretty much, I'd put up with all the hard training that had been thrown my way, and as much as you get tired and fatigued, you manage to come out the other side of it. I'd never broken down because of the hard training, and then all of a sudden having this repetitive injury develop out of getting injured in the gym the first time from squats, it just blew my mind as to, wow, I'm not invincible. I just can't just back up the next day and go again. So it taught me to be sensible and a bit smarter about what I was doing. It taught me to listen a lot more to my body. That was the first one. Thoracic stuff made me fully appreciate and realise the value of the rib cage, and how once you get thoracic injuries or spasms and all that sort of stuff, it's amazing how it's really hard to breathe. But what that also taught me was belly breathing. I did a lot of that with yoga at the time when I got thoracic issues, and it taught me that actually I don't need to breathe in the rib cage. I can actually breathe through the belly, and I probably found that to be more effective. So there's great lessons out of that.
So you held on to that belly breathing after the injuries recovered?
Yeah, and it was quite quite amazing was to then work out how to get the rhythm of the breathing right in the rowing stroke, but also breathe from the diaphragm and the pelvic floor muscles and expand through the side of the stomach and really fill that out was like, wow, I'm now feeling like I'm turbocharged. Versus as a young athlete, probably thinking that you're breathing as high as you can in your chest and trying to gasp for air. You always felt like you're under the pump aerobically. And I found the back end of my career, and probably age helps this as well, but the back end of my career I felt less demand from an oxygen perspective, but it was a physical load demand from the muscular activity. So the belly breathing, I contributed to that immensely. I thought that made a huge difference in my career. And they were probably two big things: empathy for body, listening, and then the ability to learn to breathe and relax better in the rowing stroke. Came from the thoracic stuff. The interesting part about the foot, I had an ankle injury at one stage and a bit of a knee injury, and that taught me a lot about the alignment of your feet in the boat and the pressure on the feet in the boat and all that sort of stuff. And as a young athlete, didn't pay much attention. Leg drive, you pushed your legs, your feet were at the bottom of your legs. That was about it. Later on, through the 2003 and 4 period, I became very aware, and we started talking a lot about the feeling in the feet and the feeling of connecting the hands to the feet and what the feet were doing. So we started playing around with things like floating foot stretches where the heels could move from side to side in the foot plate, wider feet, the stance was more stable. So lots of little things changed, but just the awareness for the foot pressure paid real dividends. But it came out of having ankle problem in my left ankle and not being able to quite compress forward on the bow side. And even James went through a few things where he had at the back of his knee a couple of times, a few little flare-ups with tendonitis. And it started making us more aware of things that were going on in our legs and our hips and our knees and ankle structures.
Very interesting. Now, we have a question about racing from Eric from Casitas Rowing in the US. When you're racing on multiple days, how do you stay fast going into the next race in a regatta?
For the last race is to do less than the races before. If you can manage to do less in a heat, a repechage, and a semi-final than your competitors and still get through, it just generally means you've got more in the tank to put out in the final, and I think that's pretty important. That aside, obviously being able to pace your week is helpful. And probably the thing I'd say on that too for Eric is what we noticed, and I got this from the 4, so this is really interesting as to where your lessons come from, but the 4 were masters at being able to mask how hard they were working in races and how hard they were working in training. And so I remember getting off the water a couple of times in the 4 in the heat or whatever it was, and the guys would be sitting there saying, no, we're operating at 70% or whatever it was, and you go like, what, 70%? Now as a young kid I was taught to go out there and race as fast as you possibly could, but what they were doing really well was managing to not look like what it was in terms of effort, able to hold back potentially, still get a result. Now that's I think being masterful at what you do, and I think very good athletes are very good at conserving energy through a week. The other part for me is then how you bounce back from a race or from a hit, and I think the mental thing is the routine for me was very much you finish the race, you have your quick coach crew debrief, you step away from the boat, switch off, the ability to go for a walk, talk about other things. Later on we used to go and have a coffee, and 3 hours later we go, right, now we'll switch back on for half an hour and have a chat a bit more about what the race was and a bit more about what the race is the next day or the day after. And so blocking out times to talk rowing and blocking out times to get strategic or tactical meant that the other times we were down and freshen up. You can't be on all the time, and that was something that we became very, very good at in the latter years, was learning how to switch on and switch off, and learning how to, particularly with young athletes in new crews, showing them that as well, and seeing their stress levels drop significantly over the competition week when they had a bit more freshening up time during the week. Physiologically, ice baths are great, massage is great, going for walks, doing stretches, all that sort of stuff will help the body reset for the next day or the next day's or the next effort you've got to do. And the other one too is then the mental prep for the next effort. And I think I often try to start the night before, where I start to think about the race, but contain it to say a hour period where I go through the race a few times mentally, and I find my arousal levels come back online, and it's amazing how that triggers things in the body. Important to switch off before the night's sleep, and then the next morning, same thing. try not to get into the race mode until the preparation down the boat shed starts to happen. Try to let it all go. So reading a book and having conversations about other things, having jokes about other things are really essential to keep your mind off things, particularly a big competition. So switching on, switching off, and certainly conserving energy when you don't need to be expending energy is important.
We've now got a word from our sponsors. RowingChat puts experts in touch with amateur coaches and athletes so that we can all learn more. Get yourself expert chapter-length eBooks from the Rowperfect online shop and shortcut your learning. Ben Rodford's Be Your Own Support Team covers ways for athletes to prepare their minds and their bodies for racing without professional support. Chelsea Dommett explains how to coach coxswains for coaches who've never coxed themselves. And Duncan Holland shares exercises to help scullers get their blades off the water. Improve your skill as a coach or as an athlete with the library of expert rowing ebooks on rowperfect.co.uk/shop. Now, Drew, I've been wanting to ask you a little bit about some of your YouTube work. I know that you've put up a few videos, and obviously you have been an active blogger over the years. And Grégoire from Angers in France has asked, will patient hands make the boat go faster?
Could create a bit of controversy here. Patient hands don't make the boat go faster. My simple response would be the drive makes the boat go faster, and potentially the rhythm of the athlete or athletes on the recovery can make the boat go faster. Patient hands could be an outcome of greater acceleration, greater boat speed and all that sort of stuff, but you don't do patient hands to make faster boat. I think it's really interesting that I've had a few people quizzing me over the last 2 years. You talk about slow hands, it's like, no, I've never talked about slow hands myself, but what I do talk about is if you accelerate the boat really well and then you want to take time to let the boat run, I'd prefer to take a bit more time as the blade releases from the water and then be more deliberate in the way the hands set up off the back. So slow hands is not the intent, it's getting maximum boat speed out of the drive phase and then maximum boat speed out of the recovery phase.
That's fantastic. Can you tell us about how you discovered blogging and YouTube and stuff, and why you chose to use them?
It probably goes back to, I think, 2001 and 2. I got involved with an organisation called Blue Earth Institute, which was a charity group working with kids in Australia here in schools, providing a movement and physical activity experience in schools and helping educate teachers on physical activity and skills, upskilling them. And what came out of that was the ability to then engage with the kids through journaling. And I'd always journaled as an athlete through the late 90s, through the games period and all that sort of stuff, and I found that individually rewarding. And then when I was working for this organisation, one of the comments from one of the development officers was, some of those journal entries, do you reckon you could put those online for the school kids? And so started basically posting those online onto the website, and we're going out in a newsletter to the kids, and it was really interesting as to 2002, 2003, and then one of the things that we came up with the idea was, why don't I start a blog and then just post some of my journal notes in there? And it was a blog not just about rowing necessarily, it was a blog about movement, it was a blog about experience in life and probably a young athlete coming to grips with what they were going through. And it was amazing to sort of get involved in using that medium and then seeing the responses, not just in Australia, but also around the world. And so I suppose my intent became, first and foremost to share the reality of what I was going through, and not just the perfect nature of, you see a gold medal outcome and, all the nice stuff there, but to sort of say, well, actually, it's not always perfect and it's not always clear and it's not always fun. Sometimes it can be really challenging. And so the blog was really about getting that out there in a way that sort of dispelled some of the myths. And I had a thing that, by being supported by others, I sort of saw value in it, but also getting the feedback from these school kids initially, I saw that actually it could be a rewarding thing, not just for myself doing it, cathartic sort of experience, but also for young kids in Australia, but also young rowers in Australia to realise that here's an athlete doing this, and what they're describing and sharing. the YouTube was me being lazy, to be honest. The YouTube was easier to grab film at times than to be able to get time to sit down in there and write out and capture things in writing. And my writing was never perfect. I actually had my dad criticise me plenty of times about my grammar and my spelling and my punctuation. And so the YouTube became a bit of a foil to add to the blog in another way of capturing some of that information. And I suppose the visual thing for me is stunning in rowing, that if you can get some visual footage, it tells another story. So the YouTube channel that I sort of set up was really about sort of not hiding from what we were doing, but actually putting it out there and, you know, enjoying seeing sort of comments come through, but also knowing that I learned a lot from watching guys like the Awesome Foresman and watching guys like the Pinsent and Redgraves, and even this is the thing, 96-4. Like 2 years before, I was watching the Italians and watching the British four, at the World Championships, and watching every bit of video I could get and finding out as much as I could get. So I suppose in a long-winded way, the blog and the videos became my way of sharing what I was going through in the same way that I was getting access to that sort of information. Mm-hmm. In part before that. That's how I learned. I learned through the videos that I was able to see of races and of training, but also I was able to learn from the stories that people were telling about their experiences, which often happened around the local bar at the rowing club. But it was amazing. You learn so much. I learned heaps from the Italian four and the British four in that 94, 95 period through watching their rowing races. And so when I got into the four and with the Awesome Foursome, I'd learned a lot from their training videos. So it just meant that you felt like you'd already been there a little bit and you're a bit more comfortable being out in that competition.
That's brilliant. And of course, we particularly love having rowing bloggers who are also athletes and have just awarded the Rowing Blogger of the Year 2013. So if people want to see who got the Athletes Award, go check out our blog. Now a question from Chris from the University of London Boat Club. He says, I've watched your video and I agree with the logic of delaying the slide, but I think the momentum of the hands and at least half the body are crucial to getting Newton's third law to work. Your video, however, does this only at low rates. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the thoughts are that you don't get something for nothing. So the simple thing is, if you force the back turn and you force the hands away and the body over, you get a speed bump. There's no doubt about that there. You get an improvement in boat speed. The cost, though, comes when you're back onto the feet too early, and then you have a situation where things are slowing down. And the other part too is then often people will either get through a crewmate or be late still setting and all that sort of stuff. So for me, I think what is more important than any one speed emphasis of the recovery is to say, well, if nothing else, be neutral. Have constant speed. So when the hands go away, it's with the speed of the boat. And the hands should continue at the speed of the boat all the way forward and pick up the boat speed there. If that happens, then you're always going to do pretty well. That your drive phase has produced your speed, your recovery phase is helped you not lose too much speed. So for me, I think the idea of seat timing is really essential. So softer knees for me, I often see that softer knees produce a greater end velocity average, purely for the fact that the soft knees means that when they do then start to roll, they then roll continuously through the front turn. I suspect in that question there a little bit of, well, how do you get the hands away and get the body over? I don't mind the hands moving fast. And at rate 40, the hands are probably got to be moving at the speed of the boat there, so they end up being quite quick. Where I think we get caught out in rowing is that we assume that what's being done at rate 20 is exactly the same as what we've got to do at rate 40. I like the idea that you adapt to the movement and adapt to the speed of the boat as it goes up through the gears. But what has to happen at rate 40 is you have to be supremely relaxed. And if you're relaxed and you're just moving continuously through the movement, and there's no fast movement, slow movement, stop, start sort of stuff, you're always going to go better at rate 40 because it's just more predictable. So the rate 20 for me is about just trying to make it as continuous as possible. And if you actually watch the handle speed of some of our videos, we're not actually stopping. I mean, you stop the turn at the back and you got to turn around at the catch, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that the handle is just moving with the speed of the boat. Now it looks like it slows down. What I do know is the body for me is really essential, that if the body jumps at all, centre of mass, momentum from centre of mass changes. And this is one thing that I think is not well understood, is that you've done all that work in the drive phase, you've thrown centre of mass forward, you're sitting there at the back. If you don't sit there and hold still, either press through the foot stretcher or hold the body for a fraction longer, if you move the body off the back too soon, centre of mass stops. So you've just done this thing. You've just thrown a ball, but then halfway through the throw, you've decided to pull the ball back. Rather than throwing the ball and letting it hit the wall in front and do all its work. And so if you throw a ball, you see your hand continue through the motion. If you hit a golf ball, you see the golf club continue through the motion. And for me, I think what happens in rowing is it's almost like we've hit the golf ball and then we've tried to hit the golf ball and at the same time pull it back into the backswing. And that for me is fundamentally wrong. So watching the body transfer over slowly, while also moving at 40 strokes a minute is a skill. That's a huge skill. Doing that in such a way that the boat is moving under the athlete rather than the body moving back to the boat, I think is pretty important. And I think that's where it gets complicated is how do you get the hands away? How do you get the body over? How do you get up the slide? And how do you do that all in that sort of movement? And that's where, for me, it's just more essential to say, stay relaxed, trust that the skills you developed at rate 20 will come out and reward you for your movement at rate 40 or rate 38 or whatever it might be. So sequence is still critical, but if you force the movement off the back, I just see that too often you get a boat speed increase for a short period of time, but eventually the middle distance rhythm or the efficiency of the middle of the race is lost, because you just got to work too hard to keep it going. You're picking it up every stroke almost, is what I'm probably seeing.
Moving on now to a question from Paul from Camus Rowing Club in the UK. How does the Australian national team training compare with the British?
Really, really good question. Look, I couldn't speak all that honestly about knowing too much about the GB training methodologies or programs. I mean, I think you hear whispers of certain things at times. I suppose the general view has been in the past that Australian rowers have probably worked really technically and maybe haven't done all the work that's needed at times physically. And probably the assumption is made from our side of it is that the GB rowers are doing potentially more volumes and a bit more work and certainly more robust and certainly working more around being stronger and maybe less focused on the technical. But I don't necessarily see that myself. I do see that a lot of the great GB crews are very good technically. It's just a slightly different emphasis, I think, how you start the season, possibly, where the volumes are achieved and the physiology is developed sooner in the preparation, where, and it's probably due to the water, due to the weather, we're tending to work technically at the start of the season and then trusting that the physiology will be developed over the long term of the season. I suppose in my new role now, I'm very, very conscious that the game has changed. Athletes are able to train more. Athletes are doing more. Coaches have got them doing more. Volumes have gone up over the last 20 years. Back in the days of the four and 96, it seemed to be that if you did 120 Ks to 140 Ks a week of rowing on the water, that was pretty significant. Now we know that some of our competitors and even for ourselves, 170 K weeks, 200 K plus weeks, and all that sort of stuff are not unusual. But we do have athletes generally doing a bit more full time for our senior athletes, and so I think the difference is largely a perception of power, maybe more power, more strength, more robustness in a lot of the GB rowers developed out of the program, and maybe sometimes in the Australian rowers, and I think it's a bit of rhetoric though as well, is that maybe the Australian rowers are technically drilled better and all that sort of stuff. But I'm critical. I'm very critical of our Australian rowers right now. I don't think we row technically well enough, and I certainly don't think our physical capacity has been developed well enough. And so I'm wanting to see ourselves push up on the New Zealand and say GB Canadian systems even as to the physical loading and demand of our athletes, but I also want to see if we can reassert ourselves as a really technically efficient rowing nation, because we do get the advantage of being able to row all year round, but I think we squander that to some sort of degree.
Interesting. Moving to a different question, which comes from Lewin from Maidstone Invicta Rowing Club in the UK. 2K tests on sliders, he says, valid decision or not after the last Olympic cycle. Now, you'll have to set some context for our listeners.
Contextually, we spent the last 4 years leading up to London doing slider tests and slider ergos, and we've now gone back to doing stationary. I think there's merit in both machines. I'm not questioning that there. Fundamentally, though, sliders are easy. Physically, not the demand. I don't even think they're more technically challenging. I just think that the loading of it is nothing like a rowing boat. to a degree, but the speed of it ends up being similar to a rowing boat. I can only talk personally. I went backwards and forwards in 2010 and 11 when I first started coming back into the sport in my first season. I did multiple tests on both machines. So all my lab testing, 6K testing, 2K testing, I did on both machines for a good 18 months. That meant I did twice as many tests. And the interesting thing that came out of it for me was the perception I had was I'd finish the slider test and often go, I couldn't seem to get any more out of myself. I couldn't seem to get a greater split, but I'd often recover really quickly after the test. The intensity, the respiratory demand seemed to be a bit high, and so maybe it was just getting oxygen in. Ratings seemed to be up. You did a 2K test on 40 strokes a minute on sliders. On a stationary ergo, if you were in the middle of it on 32, 33, 34, that was keeping it alive. And so I think they're fundamentally different in terms of their stimulus, which, as I say, I think both have a benefit as a stimulus, but I do like the idea that a 2K test on a stationary ergo is hard. And a slider thing, good for speed of movement can be, but ultimately I don't think that when we're moving at race pace that we're not really moving all that fast anyway. And so the impulse the slider does bring in the 4 years that we had was we're seeing leg drive ridiculously fast, we're seeing shorter strokes over very quickly, and so we're just not moving the boat very well, or we weren't moving the boat very well. So it's taken 12 months now, 18 months now, and it was a huge challenge and a bit of a fight on my side of things with some of the coaches. We had a lot of coaches sitting on either side of the fence, but we had a lot of coaches report back after the first couple of ergo tests back on stationary was like, oh, geez, we've had 4 years, we've been a bit soft on them. So I think both are great stimulus. I don't question that there, but I do think the demand of a 2K ergo or a 6K ergo on stationary is so much more closely matched to the demand of what happens on the water. We had athletes who, first 2K back, 500 metres to go, going, I just had nowhere to go. Like it was a mental exercise just to keep it on the split. Where on the sliders they were able to bump it up 4 to 6 points, and generate more and more better 500 metre split. And they'd finish and go, oh, that was awesome. And you go, yeah, but you don't do that. You haven't done that in a race. Haven't seen you do that in a race. So I think it set up a bit of a false sense of performance. And I think we've sort of dealt with the cost of that a little bit as our athletes are now dealing with going back the other way and realising their ergo scores are about 8 seconds, 6 to 8 seconds, sometimes 10 seconds difference. We knew that already, but it's certainly more demanding for them.
So a question now from Glynis from Bunbury Rowing Club. What are the reasons for the change, and are there circumstances when you still recommend the use of sliders?
Yeah, so just to reinforce that, yeah, I do. I think if you're going to train indoors, I think slider ergos works. I think stationary ergo works. I think Rowperfect works. I think all these machines indoors are really, really beneficial. Just like I think on a stationary or slider ergo or Rowperfect ergo, I think fan setting open, fan setting closed. I think training the different stimulus is the benefit of being indoors. The one disadvantage we have when we're out in the water, just to contrast that, is we've got a certain gearing. So how do we moderate things? We use rate, and boat speed as a consequence. Indoors, you can use the load, unload, load up. You can use sliders, which is you're now not moving your mass forward and back. You're basically moving the machine under you. So there's a benefit there in terms of feel. But I think from a pure testing perspective, if we're going to be serious about what the world standards are, the world's best ergo scores are done on stationary. The score's not done on stationary because we have better scores being done on sliders, but the world record marks, when you look at the 2K ergo that Rob Waddell has, it's a stationary ergo. And when we look at 6K, 5K, our ergos and all that sort of stuff, they're all stationary scores. So for me, aligning that for our team and for our benchmarking is really essential. Having people do training and monitoring on other machines is really worthwhile. But let's not lose sight of the fact that if the world's best are competing on a stationary ergo, why would we be competing on something else just to make ourselves feel good?
So thinking now about club rowers, and a question from Andy from Adelaide. What do you think club rowers shouldn't try to learn from international level rowers?
I think, that's a really good question. I think the challenge that you've got is you're looking at an international rower who's usually peak performance, everything's been done around them to get the absolute best out of themselves. They've usually moved a fair way through the fundamentals of rowing, and they've moved a fair way through all the physical demands of loading and all that sort of stuff. So when you watch an international athlete coming down the track rowing a certain way, they've learnt to row that way. They've learnt to deal with that, and it suits their body. It suits their training phase. There's a lot more information in there as to how they've achieved that. So for me, I do think that what happens is people start to talk about how to look after the boat in the recovery, or how to make it look like an Italian rower, or like a Canadian rower, or like a GB or New Zealand or something. And I think all too often we try to mimic what things look like. And I think for the general club rower, it should be about the fundamentals, And so, working out what the boat speed is for your appropriate level of competition and training to that boat speed is essential. Trusting that if you get, forward length and you get the finish position, end to end of the bookends right, and you get the sequencing right, you're going to go pretty well. I think what people do get caught up in is they see something internationally and they hear something about a way an international crew's done it volume-wise, or certain emphasis, and they don't fully appreciate the context of why that's occurred. So, for example, when the Canadians were doing their very distinctive style through 2002 to 4 and a little bit beyond, I was understanding, and this is second-hand, third-hand information, I was understanding that they were emphasising holding the blade in the water longer and longer and longer. So Mike Spracklin was basically saying, hold on longer, hold on longer. When you watched it internationally, everyone's going, all right, now we lay back. And we saw internationals do this, but we saw a lot of people around, I think, the world try to mimic the style rather than understanding what was the intent behind the approach. And I think sometimes people have got to ask the question of when they see a style of rowing, or they hear about something in a program, rather than just copying it, to sort of think about what's the fundamental reason this has happened as an outcome. So Canadians were laying back further. Well, okay, that's the visual, but they were actually trying to hold the blade in the water longer. They were trying to generate more boat speed in the water. So as a result, the layback occurred because of this intent. And I think all too often we see something internationally and we go, right, copy it, and the copy is never as good.
Very good point. An advice now needed from someone from Port Adelaide Rowing Club, who says, what advice would you offer a young rower hoping to make the national team but who doesn't go to an elite school? You don't need to do the volume of the national team. Sorry, what was that? What advice would you offer a young rower hoping to make the national team who doesn't go to an elite private school or an elite club? Ask lots of questions. Start by finding ways to get as much information as possible. I think if you're not in the elite club, or not, that for me it doesn't matter. Simple thing for a kid is that if you want to make it, if you want to be successful, find out where you can get the information from as to good training methodologies. Find out who you can get support from, who can provide good feedback and good coaching. So if you're not in those elite sort of systems or structures, dare I say it, finding good quality people who will help organise and manage you, either in a school that's not elite or even in a club that's not elite. I think motivation goes a long way, and we've sort of seen some athletes not be a part of the best clubs and best schools who are often our best athletes on the national team. But it takes a bit longer, that's all. Which, of course, is hard when you know your 18th birthday is something that can't be moved. Well, that's right. So I've had a few instances, Rebecca, where, and I'm a bit challenged by this myself, is that I often sort of think, and I used to think this way as a bit of an athlete as well, but it was like, right, well, really, until I felt like I started to become confident in this sport, it was probably 8 years. 8 years of, training after leaving school. So you're 18, you're now 26, and you start to sort of feel that when you're overseas, you go, now I'm starting to feel comfortable in this. And yet I had success early on. So when you say to a school kid, are you up for 8 years? Often the eyes straight away widen and go, oh, hell, no, I'm not up for that. So I think if you've got kids who are, patient with taking the steps they've got to take, and, there are certain cut-off points, I suppose, if you're not making a national team at a certain stage, either for under 23s or whatever it is, then you're probably going to be a bit pushed. But I've seen some athletes not make juniors, not make under 23s, and then eventually make a senior team after 5 or 6 years of staying committed in their club system, and that's a pretty outstanding thing to see. So moving on to a slightly different focus from someone else from Port Adelaide Rowing Club, asking what are the key technical characteristics to sustain good rowing at a master's level? Oh, dear me. I'm just trying to think about how old I am now. I'm 39 years of age.
I don't know anything about masters, but I'm assuming it's the same as the principles that we work on with school kids and we work on with our elite athletes as well. What's amazing in Australia is the Masters rowing. I'm sure it's the same in other countries, but I often see in some of these clubs that Masters rowings are the biggest programs. I can't speak for Masters specifically. I do know that our physiologist, Tony Rice, sports science lead over here, 2 weeks ago we were in a meeting and we were talking about older athletes and the need for older athletes to do more threshold work and potentially more high intensity stuff as things change in their body and in their makeup, I suppose, as they age. And so I suspect for Masters is they've done the years and years of Ks potentially. And that competitive spirit makes it pretty energising, doesn't it?
Oh, so it does. I was in Adelaide for the Australian Masters recently, and let me tell you, you have to work hard to win medals there.
Well, I think Nick Green and a few of the guys that he rode with all went and did a Masters race. This is about 10 years ago, and they went up to Ballarat thinking, oh, this will be easy, it's 1,000 metres. And so for me, I think that's the thing. It's cool to watch, seeing people of all ages, and Masters are just one of the age categories, out there training and loving our sport is fantastic. So I think the principles are probably the same. I think recovery rates are different, but using competition and using races and using that joy of being out in the water has got to be essential.
Now, it's perfectly clear you have a great sense of fun, and I'm sure that you've been on many rowing camps where there's some pretty funny things that have happened. Can you tell us what your philosophy is towards fun as a coach and behaviour when you're on tour?
What happens on tour stays on tour. Is that...
Is there an anecdote you could share?
Let me just ask, is everyone here who's on this call okay with not saying anything beyond this now?
It is broadcast.
I'll use an example from last year. So we had some challenging behavioural stuff. We've got a younger group of athletes, so we had some behavioural stuff that was a bit challenging. The biggest message for the athletes was, hey, look, you've stuffed up. That's okay. You can't stuff up too many times before we do something in terms of sending you home or whatever it might be. But you've made a mistake. That's okay. So now let's make sure we get back onto the task of doing the job properly. You still there?
I'm still here.
There is effectively behavioural challenges, but then saying, well, okay, we'll come down hard on you because of that. But how do we also make sure we remind them that, what, we've dealt with that now, let's move on and actually make it pretty enjoyable. So my philosophy is that you train hard and when you're off the water, you relax and enjoy yourself. I think going over the top and doing anything that gets people into trouble with the law is really problematic. But we do know we're dealing with some very young athletes in our teams. And so I think judging them harshly for one indiscretion or one or two mistakes is not right either. But I certainly think knowing that people need to know the boundaries is essential. The thing I love doing is, even when you're on the water, the ability to have a joke out there, the ability to sort of know that you can really have a good time. And I say good time, it's much more enjoyable when you're going fast, and it's much more enjoyable when you feel like you're able to do on the water what the plan is and the training is. When you're extremely tired, there's no better way of dealing with that than having a good laugh.
That's very nicely put. Now, I have a question from Des Moines Rowing Club. Have you ever thought of writing a book about your life or coaching?
I don't know who would want to read it. Look, I've had a few people sort of mention to me, when I was writing the blog as to, you should write a book on rowing, or book on life. But look, I think there's plenty of those sort of things that do get written. I think for me, I don't mind writing things and putting things down about the experiences you're in. I think retrospectively, there might come a time where I might put pen to paper. But I think, I'm probably more passionate about, at some stage, getting a group of like-minded people together and writing a book about rowing and performance. That's less about me or one person, more about the experience that multiple people have had, or the principles of the activity, and maybe even putting the stories together that make sense. I mean, you mentioned before the call as to someone like a Harry Mahon, and I read a piece on him in I think it was the rowing book that was created by Peter Mallory over in the US, and I think it was a chapter on Harry, and I remember reading that and thinking to myself, geez, that's awesome. Like, I met Harry just a few times, and he always came across as, for me, quietly spoken and just really matter of fact, and really insightful and all that sort of stuff. And you meet a guy like that for 2 or 3 times, but then you read this chapter about how he coached and the crews he had and the influence he had not only in New Zealand but then in Great Britain, and you think to yourself, well, wow, that's if that wasn't written, if that wasn't captured, then a person like myself wouldn't be able to read it. So I'd love to be able to put stuff like that together, but less so about me, more so about maybe some of the experiences, some of the people that I've actually been involved with. So there's probably plenty of good stories, but a collaborative effort would be really fascinating, rather than an individual bio on myself.
I'll send you a DVD we've got of Harry talking about his ideas about technique. I think you'll enjoy it if you haven't seen it before.
Fantastic, that'd be great.
So, last question. Do you know whether you've won the Tommy Keller medal this year?
No.
Was that no to both? Or no, you don't know?
No. I got told about the Tommy Keller medal. I've been nominated a few times. I'm going to be the bridesmaid forever, I reckon.
You're in good company, don't worry.
No. It's look, they're those. I saw the list the other day of the current list, and it's actually interesting. At Lucerne last year, I saw Eskild Eberson there, and I looked at him and I said, "Oh, you've obviously got the medal." And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Mate, congratulations." So for me, I'm not deflecting the question here, but I'm trying to sort of say that I think there's a great history in our sport. And I don't know a lot about the Keller family or the Tommy Keller medal as such, but I do know that what I've had shared with me and the people I've seen in it, it's just a great honour for people that do achieve it. And there's a great list of people there. But also I think what gets forgotten a little bit is some of the amazing people that don't get recognised in that regard that have been influential on our sport sort of thing. And I suppose I'd like to be a student of the sport. So no, I don't. And I'd probably feel a bit uncomfortable if I was.
Thank you so very much, Drew. It's been absolutely brilliant having you on the show with us. I know the listeners have also really enjoyed it and will join me in thanking you. We're going to wrap up with a quick summary of the prize that you're giving to our listeners and subscribers to the Rowperfect newsletter. Do you want to tell everyone about that?
Well, put it into context. When you asked me yesterday, is there some memorabilia? And I have to be honest to everyone that the very first thing I thought of was I've got 3 or 4 Olympic bags there with clothes in it. And you said, can you find something specific? So I had my wife see what she could find. So there's a hat there, I know for sure. But the person might be surprised that there might be another item in there when I get back home to Melbourne and can put it in a bag for you.
Fantastic. We'll find out at the end of the month on the 1st of June whether it's been won by a man or a woman, and we'll get in touch. See you all next time. Thanks to my guests. Thanks to the producer, Theo Martin, and we'll be on air in a month's time.